This Chicago Public Media production is made possible in part by listeners just like you. Become a new member of WBEZ today or renew your membership online at WBEZ.org. Thanks.
This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell. It's Thursday and time for our Global Activism series. Each Thursday, we hear about an individual who's decided to work to make the world a better place. Today, we're talking with groups that are coming together to help with women and dignity in Hope in Eastern Congo. We're talking first with Ann Ream from the Voices and Faces Project, and we've talked with Ann before in the program. Hi, Ann.
Hi, Jerome.
And the Voices and Faces Project is a documentary initiative created to advocate for survivors of sexual violence. Tell us a little more about this.
Yeah, I mean, we really founded the organization based on the notion that testimony is the most important force for social change and can be a really important source for healing. And that we only began to understand social justice issues through the power of stories. And there's both a need for the public to hear the stories of women who have lived through rape and torture and sexual violence. And there's a need for the women to share their own stories.
And you've done work where?
I know you and I met through our work in Atenco, Mexico, yes. So we've captured stories from the United States, North America, Latin America. We're starting to now look to head to Afghanistan and, of course, working with Galya on going over to Congo and finding those stories and bringing them to the attention of the public.
And how does this help the women involved? What happens?
Testimony really works on two levels, and it's an interesting question because people often say it must be very healing for these women to share their stories, but
or traumatic.
Well, exactly. I mean, what I often say is that we don't share our stories because they're necessarily healing. We share our stories because they're necessary in a world that too often fails to understand the scope and scale of sexual violence. And so I think very often what women are seeking to do through the power of their stories is to demand justice, to demand accountability, to rise up really in the face of impunity, which is something we see in Latin America, we see in Congo, and we see all over the world. We see at universities in the United States. And that's really how Galya and the Center for Forced Migration and the Voices and Faces Project came together.
Galya Ruffer is here. She's the director of Northwestern University's Center for Forced Migration Studies and is partnering with Voices and Faces for an event tonight at Northwestern's Buffett Center called The Importance of Bearing Witness, Testimony, Justice, and the Global Fight to End Sexual Violence. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How did you get involved in this?
Well, I got involved in this because I founded the Center for Forced Migration Studies, and I came in contact with someone from the National Lawyers Guild, and they were looking for someone to do documentation of massive sexual violence in the Congo. And I hadn't really known much about it at that time. And as I started to do the research, I realized that we were pouring in millions of dollars, in fact, towards criminal justice programs to try to combat sexual violence and impunity in the Congo. And I became very curious about this, of course, because when I read about the Congo, and especially the east where the instability was, it seemed kind of unimaginable to me how this project was going to work out in practice in a place where there was no running water, no electricity, no courts, no money, no functioning banking system.
What did you find out?
Well, I landed on the ground. I didn't really want to at first start, my research there with the main international organizations, so I kind of just hit the pavement and started to meet a lot of local NGOs, including Therese Kalungu, who is here right now with us in the studio, but she just speaks French, so we're not going to be hearing from her right now. And I found out, of course, that it's a very complicated process to try to bring justice in the Congo. Everything from even catching perpetrators, with a motorcycle, and trying to bring them to a court of law, to the fact that through the 2 years of my research in the Congo, I discovered that not one woman was actually serviced or her life was made better through this process of criminal justice.
I imagine that's kind of how do you feel about that? Is that kind of did you feel, well, this is a kind of a Western construct that we are going to be able to find and create this kind of justice in this place?
I think where my work has gone now is really to this concept of moral outrage. It seems that, the Western construct responds to moral outrage, that when it reaches a certain level, we take action. But the stories I heard from women, and very similar to Anne Ream's work, the women had personal stories, and actually they were very happy to tell me. They were happy someone wanted to listen to their personal stories. But somehow this got lost. These testimonies of the women got lost when it got collectivized into our need, to have this system respond to moral outrage.
What were some of the stories that you were hearing that you want to bring to even this event tonight?
Most of the stories I heard that very much are different than the kind that can be brought in the international criminal court are women who told of lives that really since the age of 3 oftentimes had been raped. And when we think about rape in our Western context, we imagine it as an isolated incident, some shocking incident that occurs. And so, when I went there, I thought I was going to hear about some isolated incident when rebel groups descended on a village. And that's true. Rebel groups descend on a village and they rape and loot, and that's horrific. But the women wanted to tell me more about the land they lost, about the inability to go to school, about the inability after, about being distanced from their family, being rejected by husbands. It was really the social justice concerns that animated the stories. And the rape kind of fell to the side. And it's not that it wasn't horrific very often, but in the context of their lives and their concept of ownership over their bodies, they didn't experience the rape in the way that I had anticipated.
There's also, I think one of the really interesting things that I've learned from Galya and that we often hear from women, when you really ask the right questions and talk to them not only, as Galya noted, about a specific incident in their life, but talk to them more broadly about their lives, is you come to realize how often, and this, in my experience, transcends regionality and class, how often sexual violence is part of the wallpaper or the backdrop of women's lives. And that it really poses, as Galya noted, some moral challenges to us, because we do tend to be very reactive when it comes to specific events that we can wrap our hands around, specific historical moments or public crises. And in fact, sexual violence, for most people, most women around the world, is in many cases ongoing. And part of that landscape. And until we confront that and really listen to the testimony of survivors like the survivors Galya is talking to, or the ones we're talking to on the Voices and Faces Project, we won't be called to change something much broader than a single event or response.
Galya, how many people were involved with the Panzi Hospital? For people who don't know what the Panzi Hospital is, but it's a hospital in eastern Congo, and when Secretary of State Clinton goes to eastern Congo, she visits the Panzi Hospital, and it's kind of the landmark ground zero spot for sexual violence.
Yeah, so Panzi Hospital was founded pretty much by Dr. Mukwege after the war started in the Congo, and it is the only hospital that without having to make payment, women can be treated for sexual violence, specifically fistulas. And it is only, so they have even now 15 women arriving per day. And in any given month, there's about 280 women still ongoing. So that is, the amount of women arriving. And it was only more recently that they set up a justice program because women, there wasn't really any legal system. And so Maître Thérèse is the main attorney. She's the director of the justice program at Panzi Hospital. And then they do the legal process for the women and also take a holistic approach to the women's lives in this, concept of trying to give them justice.
And she's going to be there tonight for the event from 5 to 7 at Annie Mae Swift Hall at Northwestern's campus. What will happen tonight?
It's going to be quite a disturbing evening. What we've arranged at Northwestern, we have a communications program run by Soyini Madison, and she has organized a performance, a grad student has put it together, of some of the testimonies that Therese has collected. We also have on exhibit some of the testimonies, and so I'm hoping that the people can bear witness, to this horrific event. And then Therese will do a talk about what is the justice program at Pansy and what are the challenges, specifically in regards to social justice. And then our hope is, through a moderated panel, to hear from people like Anne Ream and Leslie Thomas of the Artworks Project on how their kind of work, as opposed to, the legal process, really expands our ability to bear witness to rape.
And now, so part of this is a performance of testimonies collected?
Yes.
And so there's been, who exactly working on the performances?
The Soyini Madison at the she's the director of the Comm Studies program at Northwestern, and we have a new oral history project in African Studies.
All right, so that'll be sounds very moving, probably, to have these people get up there and try to live these testimonies.
Yes, I think it'll be really interesting to hear from the graduate students who have to perform this. I felt terrible once I translated them from Therese, handing them over, because I don't know that they knew what they were getting into.
How many people do you think will come tonight? I mean, what kind of folks are going to come?
Well, on our Facebook site, we have 90 people signed up, and I know Voices and Faces has been doing advertising, and so has Leslie Thomas from Artworks. So we don't know, actually, in the end of the day, how many people.
It's interesting when you do a project like this. I know we did a Stories on Stage performance that focused on fiction and memoir around the issue of sexual violence and violence against women broadly. And we actually had an extraordinary turnout. But Galya said something I think that's very interesting about the experience of the performers who are given this challenge of taking the testimony and the stories of women and bringing them to the attention of the public. I think when we use the phrase bearing witness, the implication often is that those who have lived through violence should be bearing witness to their experiences. And yet, in truth, part of what we want to say with events like this is that we all need to bear witness, and that these performers are really integrating these stories into their own experience, and they are changed by that process of reading and sharing these stories. And we hope the audience is as well, and that they leave sharing these stories further, because we've for too long, I think, put the onus on those who have lived through violence to be the only voices around the issue.
And Anne, how is this going to change your Voices and Faces project? How do you get more involved with Eastern Congo?
That's a great question. And one of the things we're doing that we're partnering with Galya on now is getting over to Congo. We have a very large community of women through Therese who are eager to share their stories, not unlike the women in Atenko, who initially looked at our project and looked at the stories and said, what does the experience of a young woman in New York or Los Angeles and Chicago have to do with my experience in Latin America? And yet when they encountered the testimony, for example, specifically of a young woman who was raped on her college campus, and the institution of that campus refused to hear her story and refused to grant her any form of either symbolic or practical justice, they saw their own stories in that. And I think one of the really wonderful things that happens through our work is we're able to not only, when we go to a place, when we go to Congo, we'll not only be able to listen to the women in Congo, but also bring the stories of the other women we've heard from, so that we can identify the commonalities between these stories, but also, as Galya noted, identify the differences and be able to come back to the U.S. through our website, through our testimonial writing workshop, through our outreach program. We've now actually traveled to 40 U.S. states and 3 continents to share stories from our project. And we don't just share our own stories, we share the stories of every woman we've interviewed. So we can bring those stories back from a place like Congo and go into a community in the United States and touch on what Galya's just talked about, the realities of seeking justice in a region without running water, or with an emerging justice system, or where there are restrictions that people in the U.S. can't even imagine, and then try to get them to go there imaginatively so that they can respond more compassionately and feel the urgency. When you talk to Galya or you talk to Therese, and you talk to any survivor of violence from any region, you feel the urgency of this issue in a very unique way. And I think part of our job on the Voices and Faces Project is somehow to translate that urgency for the broadest possible audience.
Anne Ream is from the Voices and Faces Project. Galya Ruffer is with the Center for Forced Migration Studies at Northwestern University, and the event tonight is The Importance of Bearing Witness, Testimony, Justice, and the Global Fight to End Sexual Violence. It's at Northwestern University at the Annie Mae Swift Hall, 1920 Campus Drive from 5 to 7. It's
7 to 9.
7 to 9. And it's free and open to the public. And we'll put a link up to your website. And you've got your own Facebook page, obviously. Thanks a lot for joining us, and good luck on the project in the future.
Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you, Jerome.